It's time to get a little bit crazy in the RotoViz Overtime community. Superflex draft over at the FFPC. We are drafting in the $35 FFPC Superflex tournament, and we are going to talk through some of the strategies, talk through what our plan is. We're going to have a lot of fun doing it. These drafts, Shawn, can get pretty unique because the drafters know what we want to do. We did a show on Friday discussing what we want to do, and they also are RotoViz subscribers, so they have access to all the content, the tools, and of course, Shawn's ranking is up on site. So they have a fair idea, Shawn, of what we are looking to do. But I'm excited. Are you excited? As we wait 2 picks away till our selection at pick 9.
Yeah, this is going to be fantastic. I mean, this is my favorite format in fantasy football. And to get to draft with the listeners, I was mentioning in the chat that these leagues are my favorite to draft in every year. The listeners do a fantastic job, and being able to participate here with the community, it's just one of my favorite parts of it. So these next couple hours, Colm, are going to be a real treat. And as you mentioned, we are waiting to see who will be available to us early on in the first round at the 9th pick. The first 6 selections are somewhat chalky, and then we get Allen, Mahomes, Hurts, then Christian McCaffrey in there, Stroud, Lamar Jackson. I don't think that is a surprise. The question here will be whether or not CeeDee Lamb makes it, whether or not Anthony Richardson makes it, what we do with the 109 if Richardson is here or if he's not. So those, I think, are the interesting questions. Do you have interest in Richardson? One of the things we talked about the other day, I do have him ranked a little bit lower than the consensus, but still in the first round. And he is at the end of a tier in terms of thinking through how we want to play this particular format when we're looking at round 1 and having that foundation QB.
He was off interest, but he went off the board 1 pick before our selection. But I think I would have pushed to play him through in the second round if it was a case that he made us back to us. So we have 40 seconds, Shawn. We have double the time that we normally have if we were doing our underdog drafts. So we have a little bit of time to think through it. But the only wide receiver gone yet is CeeDee Lamb. Obviously, you mentioned already CMC is off the board. Have you a preference of the wide receivers? Do you want to make a call for Sam Laporta? What do you want to push to do here at the first pick?
Well, I think this is probably Breece Hall. And because the running backs are so valuable in this particular format, really compared to almost all other formats, in part because we have a little bit more balance between running back and wide receiver when we think through the flex spots, but also because that running back, if he's a superstar like a Breece Hall, he's very viable in that super flex position. We talk about getting 1 star QB early and then waiting. To make that work, you really have to have the foundation pieces at the other spots. You need to have someone who can go out there and put up the types of scores that will fit fairly consistently in that super flex spot. And then also when you have the other big scores that work, that he's also gapping the field at the RB1. I think that Breece Hall is an interesting first round pick in this format for those reasons. And Colin, the question I had for you, because RV drafters can tend to be a little bit more wide receiver heavy, I don't necessarily think they will be in this format when you consider that, it doesn't reward wide receivers in quite the same way. But Bijan Robinson coming back through, one way to potentially be a little bit unique, but also to have that type of firepower for week 17 to win the $100,000. I think that RB start, if you're getting, say, the 2 guys who could be the top 2 players, that is interesting to me. Another thought that I have is that Kyler Murray and the sort of NFC West, a pretty interesting way to play this here if we didn't want to go with what we had discussed on Friday, which is kind of making that early reach for Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, so we do at this point miss out on Bijan, and I was, before you'd mentioned it, I was starting to be very intrigued by that possibility based on how we talked through, being able to play more running backs, the wide receivers maybe not having as much of an advantage in this format. Joe Burrow goes 1 pick before us. We are back up on the clock. Dak Prescott's the next quarterback, and then we're like, Jordan Love. But you mentioned going for Williams. And I'm on board with it if that's the way you want to go. There's no other player here that I have to have. I'm probably looking at Wilson Garrett Wilson as the next player. So I'm on board with getting the quarterback here and then really pushing it throughout the rest of the draft.
So let's go ahead and take Kyler Murray. That'll set us up for that NFC West oriented build.
Jaden Daniels was, I said Caleb Williams a second ago. I meant Jaden Daniels. He was the one that I thought we were leaning towards there. Hit me with the thoughts on Murray. He's somebody I haven't been actively targeting that much.
Yeah, I think you get the rush element to it potentially, even though I think we could see that decline for him over these next 2, 3, certainly 5 years. And it also sets us up for this NFC West build that I've been working through a little bit and sort of discussing some things with Blair that we'll talk about on future shows. One of the things that I like about these NFC West teams is that their buys fit nicely together. Their week 15, 16, 17 work nicely together. Now, Arizona is not necessarily as strong as the Rams and the 49ers, but obviously those quarterbacks are not necessarily going to give us the same type of gap that we get from some of these other players. The Arizona selection sets us up for Trey McBride. It sets us up to play off of the Los Angeles Rams, which I'm coming to believe are one of the teams that you should be pretty heavily in on this season. It's also vaguely interesting because the Jets, where we have Breece Hall in the first round, they set up nicely in the week 17 off of the Rams. And so if we're able to kind of build out with Rams, Cardinals, and hopefully even 49ers, Seahawks here, we can kind of manage some of our buys. We can manage some of the other types of considerations that we have. And I think the overall roster ends up being pretty high powered. Colm, one of the things that you and I have talked about in terms of the teams that were able to advance to the finals the last couple of years, we had a Jalen Hurts, we had a Justin Fields. Kyler Murray, somebody who fits that archetype pretty well, especially if we get a breakout season from Marvin Harrison, which based on ADP, a lot of fantasy managers are certainly pricing it.
Yeah, so we'll see how the draft progresses and maybe, at the end, looking back as to what potential options we could have taken at that pick and how everything settles into place. But I think it's interesting to target the entire division and work through it that way. My biggest concern with that, Shawn, is obviously Kyler Murray, as you mentioned, does open you up to Trey McBride. I'm very skeptical of Trey McBride getting back to us in the third round in this draft, but that would be perfect if it does happen. For people who maybe are listening or watching and aren't familiar with the FFPC format, it is tight end premium, so there will obviously be an additional benefit to having those guys on your rosters. 1.5 points per reception for tight ends. And then in this format, it is a case where we talked a little bit about the running backs potentially being more valuable. You have to start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and then there is 2 flex positions. One of those flexes can be Superflex. So that limits versus the regular FFPC format where you could start 2 wide receivers in the flex. In this format, you're likely to be heading and starting a quarterback there if your roster so allows it. So we start with Breece Hall and Kyler Murray. Since our pick, it has gone with Dak Prescott, Gibbs, Nakua, Garrett Wilson, Jordan Love, AJ Brown, Jaden Daniels. I think this is going to be a lot of fun now to see, because this is where a regular draft in this format versus a draft with our OT community is going to really diverge and see where things shake up a little bit. So Sam Laporta goes to the Josh Allen drafter at the 212. And Shawn, we have plenty of time to talk. Much more relaxing with the 60 seconds on the clock for podcast purposes. I think we should mention that at the start of this one. Not as, I'm sure there'll still be a few, famous Shawn Siegele filibusters throughout this show to get my heart rate going.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to get out of here without a few of those. Colm, that is completely true. On the other hand, the listeners have been fired up and ready. So we've moved through these first 2 rounds pretty quick. Like you mentioned, Laporta going there at the 212. So your thesis, which I would have a pretty hard time disputing, is that Trey McBride is not going to come back to us at ADP in this league.
That would be my yes, and there's my thesis confirmed. The drafter in the one spot has started with Josh Allen, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, and then the drafter in the 2 slot, who is Patrick Mahomes, has taken Travis Kelce in the 3rd round to pair with Jaden Daniels. So both very strong starts from those 2 names. That was my fear, Shawn. I didn't really expect him to get beyond the 304 with this format, but we'll be able to adjust and adapt. And our hearts are only slightly broken at this point of the draft. One question the listeners may have is, in this particular format, you mentioned the NFC West kind of angle at it. Kyler Murray, somebody who you currently have ranked as the quarterback 11, taking him above some of the other options. Is that more so to try and play out the strategy off the NFC West versus where you would take them in a one-off scenario?
It is. At the same time, he'll probably move up a little bit in the next ranking set. And one of the other things that I'm looking at a little bit there is that when we're in this time period where, there are a lot of these super flex drafts going off the board all the time. So it's not that there is any kind of huge sample issue, but Colm, I didn't necessarily want to contribute to Jaden Daniels' ADP rising by taking him a full, almost a full round ahead. We're going to be in some other drafts where we'd like to be able to get him at the back of round 2. In this particular one, he does actually make it to the 211. So that's nice to see that the other listeners also used a little bit of restraint there. We do get Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews at the 302 and the 305. We're going to be under some pressure at the tight end position column. How early are you comfortable reaching for a Kyle Pitts if we assume that Dalton Kincaid, who has an ADP around the 404, that he also doesn't make it to us here?
Yeah, what I'm intrigued to see is obviously how it plays out, but the 2 players that I'm looking at those tight end names that you mentioned, but I'm also with the Kyler Murray pick really, wanting to see if Marvin Harrison, who, as I say, that goes off the board. I was hoping he was somebody who was going to make it back to us at that point. So I think, outside of Drake London, Chris Olave, I think we're in play at this point already for those tight ends. I think with the 3 drafters at the turn that will be going after us, with those 6 picks, I think we're in a point where we have to, as you put it, potentially reach for some of these guys versus miss out completely on them, with them going quite a bit earlier than they would by ADP. For reference, Kincaid is usually, the tight end 5, but that is in the 4th round. So the not too far, Shawn, ahead of ADP. So he's probably leaning in here to be the prime target for me at this particular point. As Saquon Barkley goes off the board. Harrison was obviously the name that I would have wanted, but you mentioned the rushing upside of Murray. That also allows him to be someone who doesn't necessarily have to be stacked. And although you mentioned the week 17 element in it, the final for this, is a much smaller field final. So the, amount of stacking and uniqueness that is needed is not as much as, something like the BBM finals, for example. So we are up on the clock. Kincaid makes it to us. There's a number of quarterbacks available, but I think we're outside of Williams. We're probably okay to pass through. The 2 drafters in 11 and 12 have not taken a quarterback yet, so they probably interested there. Do you want to push tight end and take? I think we push quarterback based on what we had discussed on the previous show, but what do you want to do here?
Yeah, it's always tough because I do think that this is a pretty intriguing price for Caleb Williams.
Yeah, he's basically got pushed down because of the tight ends going that bit earlier. He's usually the 3rd pick of the 3rd round. You'd be getting him at 309. So it would be unique to take him there.
So I like that. I think that he's the other pick that actually works in very nicely when you're thinking about doing some stacking by division. The NFC North, the other one that I really, really like. And so then when you're thinking about where's the upside, where's the value in the NFC North at quarterback, you're really looking at Caleb Williams as being the guy who could potentially be a star, right? We know Jared Goff is going to be good. We know that JJ McCarthy is going to go relatively late because he's a rookie who may not start at the beginning, and they may be somewhat conservative with him. We know that Jordan Love is going to be very expensive. He went at the 209 in this particular draft. And so you work your way back around to where is that sort of sweet spot of price and upside. I think it's with Caleb Williams. And certainly, even though you can argue that all of the receiving targets for Williams are tricky from a valuation perspective, you have a lot of different chances to hit with him, right? You can select any of the 3 receivers. You can select Cole Kmet. So you have some options there. So I really like that play, but I didn't want to come out of these first 4 rounds without a tight end. And I do think that Kyle Pitts is also going to go in the interim here, even though his ADP is in round 5.
Yeah, so his ADP is in round 5, which again, we're adjusting to the draft for him. I think it's completely plausible that he does go. There is 3 picks before our selection. Chris Olave, who would have been in the conversation at our next pick, did go 1 pick after us. Then Williams went, who would have obviously been a dream scenario if he made it back through, but I don't think he was going to, as we talked about before the pick. So we'll see what plays out, Shawn, here. The other thing is, there is a number of quarterbacks by ADP that could go off the board, which in a situation like this, we would be kind of hoping that may be the case. The next picks by ADP are Tua, Jared Goff, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, and Kirk Cousins. Then you're into Kyron Williams, Derrick Henry, Devontae Adams, Matthew Stafford. So there's a lot of quarterback options that could go off the board. And by ADP, you're having to scroll down that a little bit to get to Kyle Pitts. So maybe he does sneak his way through as Goff goes off the board. So what we would like to see here is, quarterbacks getting hit as Trevor Lawrence goes off the board. And then maybe that allows us to get back. Is there any other names outside of Pitts that you're looking at here as a potential candidate? I think the way to obviously try and supercharge a roster like this in the tight end premium format is adding another tight end, which we would think as of an elite tight end. And, there's absolutely no chance that he's going to get back to us in the 5th round. And then, Evan Ingram's probably going to be off the board. Then you're into Kittle and Njoku as the last 2 options. So any other names that you want to pitch for in case we miss out here?
Well, I think that Nico Collins is such a high upside play that he is going to be interesting. I think that Brandon Ayuk is an interesting pick for some of the reasons that we already mentioned, where you have that NFC West element to it. He does go there at the 403 column. This seems like Kyle Pitts to me, although one of the issues, and this is one of the things kind of working through again on some of these divisions that work better than others, Pitts ends up being the same buy that we have with Dalton Kincaid. There's a little bit less of an issue in FFPC where you're probably going to get to 4 tight ends.
Yeah, so that is the downside. The other part is Kirk Cousins is going to go off the board in the next couple of picks, so there's no stacking element to it, but there's also not that with Nico Collins. So we could go with Collins at wide receiver or Kyle Pitts. I'm expecting us to go with 4 to 5 tight ends, so I'm willing to take Pitts, and I think that's the pick that I would prefer to make.
Okay, so we'll go with Pitts here. One of the things that we did discuss on the preview show is that receivers tend to fall in this format. Now, again, they're not going to fall as far in this room as they fall in many rooms, but based on what you need to win this tournament, we're going to see names across these next 3, 4, 5 rounds that we like a lot. And so we're going to have to load up through those. We're also going to see the QBs continue to fall, taking a little bit of the price pressure out of the QB room and maybe moving it in the direction of receiver. We have Malik Neighbors who goes off the board right here. He's kind of the other person that we probably should have considered. In my rankings, he is the next guy there, or would have been the pick Neighbors and Kyron Williams, who is still there. Colm, any regret on not taking Neighbors? I think that especially with the overall context that we're going to get at tight end and similar to the situation that we have, in hoping for a Trey McBride to come back, I think we're probably going to have the selection of Brock Bowers occur long before we get to his ADP in round 7. The other thing here, and something that is worth kind of bringing up as we discussed this NFC West element to it, if we take George Kittle instead of Kyle Pitts, then we accomplish multiple objectives. Number 1, getting some San Francisco there, and number 2, not having that same bye.
The other thing is, and it depends what we have available when it comes back. I do think that Kittle is going to make it back to us, most likely. And then obviously you could still accomplish that feat. I don't really have a regret with the Pitts versus Neighbors. Neighbors may well be the player who scores the most fantasy points, but I think in this room, with how we're expecting the draft to play out, and I still, I mentioned the quarterback element. I think a few of those names are going to go now before it gets back to us again. Although we do have the team in 4 and 2 having already 2 quarterbacks. The team in 4 does take Matthew Stafford. That gets them up to 3 quarterbacks through 4 rounds. So we'll see how, this is one we're going to just have to adapt to, because ADP will slightly be skewed based on the information we discussed at the very start, with it being against the OT community. So our draft so far is Breece Hall, Kyler Murray, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts. And I always think, Shawn, after this point of the draft, it's very early to have, a feel of how it's going to feel at the end, because, it's a 20-round draft and there's going to be so many parts of the jigsaw to put together before the end, where, we could start now and say that, Kyle Pitts' pick is, perfect for this team, and maybe it ends up that we don't get any of the other tight ends and we're like, well, we're in trouble in week 12. But if we also end up with 2 of our preferred targets as the draft progresses, and we have 2 other potential tight end options to play to cover that week 12, then all those questions evaporate. So there's a long way to play out in this particular draft, and I'm excited to see how it goes. So we get Neighbors, as Shawn mentioned, the pick after, then Tua, Kyron Williams, Nico Collins, Matthew Stafford, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Adams. Number of those, getting big contract extensions over the last couple of weeks. So it's good to see those young wide receivers getting paid, and also for dynasty purposes gives them some security in terms of their value over the course of the next couple of seasons. But we are going to have to wait now, Shawn, 9 picks before the next selection. How would you feel about somebody like a George Kittle if he did come back to us? Is there anything you've seen from your research with 3 tight ends in the first 5 rounds? That's not something that I don't think we've ever done as a combined draft team.
Yeah, that's going to be unusual enough that you're going to have difficulty
getting a sample,
trying to decide if that is in fact the way to play it. I'll pull it up here in the roster construction explorer just so that everyone can kind of play along with us. If we put it as 3 tight ends between rounds 2 and 6, you have 49 teams that have done that in the past, a 10% win rate. You have double the expected percentage of really high-end scoring teams. So, yeah, I don't think that is necessarily something we want to shy away from. If the room gives us that, we should definitely take it.
Yeah, so the room doesn't give it the George Kittle drafter, or is the team out of the 3rd spot, which I think is a very nice team, with Aaron having his team set up with Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Jonathan Taylor, Jalen Waddle, George Kittle. Very interesting through those opening rounds. The player, Shawn, we were hoping that would have made it to us was Brock Bowers. He goes off the board to the drafter in the 5th spot. They already had Mark Andrews to go with Garrett Wilson, Nico Collins, and CJ Stroud. So we're 4 picks away. I think our ideal pick for the conversation we had around the NFC West would be Cooper Kupp coming back to us here. The thing that happens to me in these drafts, Shawn, is I have very little faith that the targets that we have will last more than one pick, as we say the names, based on our historical feelings in the OT drafts. But having a lot of fun so far. So we have 2 picks before us. The other name that we have in there is Kirk Cousins, who would be moving quite a bit at this point past ADP. Could go with our Kyle Pitts pick as well to give us that second quarterback. But I think this is one again where we just have to wait and see what is available. We hadn't, I always preference any time I draft Kirk Cousins with, he's not my favorite quarterback, but then I draft him anyway. But we hadn't talked about drafting a second quarterback, in the 5th round. But is he somebody who, if it sits up here with the opportunity that will be available with Pitts, that it would make sense for you? Ideally, I think we get Cup and then see if Cousins sneaks back around potentially.
Well, to give listeners a feel, the 3 teams that have picks in the interim, one has Joe Burrow, one has Jared Goff, the other one has both Caleb Williams and Trevor Lawrence. That team, Eric, I think would probably not select a 3rd QB, but certainly a second quarterback for either of those other teams is fairly likely at this point, even though, again, we're going to see some teams who are approaching it in the same way. I guess I think that our chances for Cup to come through, well, they're decent. Right? DJ Moore is the top guy by ADP. You think?
I think you're correct.
Or will not?
I think there's a chance. Looking at Cousins, he's usually going at the the 401, and we are now at the 509, and we're a Kyle Pitts team. I think it would make pretty perfect sense to take him in this lineup.
One of the things, I don't think that Cup is going to come back around, just to sort of put that out there. All the rest of the names in between are names that the RV community is going to be out on. Having said that, I'm still very comfortable taking Cousins.
Yeah, let's do it, and let's see if our luck is in, Shawn. There will be other names if we don't get Cooper Kupp. If it wasn't a Kyle Pitts team, I think I would probably pass on Cousins there. But I think that's almost a 2-round ADP discount based on where he is going in general. So it makes a lot of sense for this team. So now we hold our breath and see what happens over the next number of picks. But Shawn mentioned the names that are in the queue. Aaron Rodgers is in the queue. Josh Jacobs, Baker Mayfield, Pacheco, Evan Ingram, Deshaun Watson. Then you're into DJ Moore, Joe Mixon, Cooper Kupp, Rashad White, Alvin Kamara, James Cook. So there's a number of names in there that we aren't really targeting, and we kind of hope that they go off the board here, Shawn, in the next 6 picks and force Cooper Kupp down towards us. The other thing, we passed on Caleb Williams with the Dalton Kincaid pick. That would have been a potential here with DJ Moore in this kind of range of the draft. So there's lots of other ways the draft could have played up. Evan Ingram did go off the board. I was expecting him to be one of the picks here in the next little bit, as DJ Moore followed to the Caleb Williams drafter out off the 11 spot. Shawn, Devontae Smith, another name who, if we did miss out on Cooper Kupp, I think would be a player I would, I've absolutely no problem him getting on the roster at any point here. So who's stepping up for you after the Cooper Kupp selection, since you have said that he will definitely be gone and we have no chance to get him on this roster? Doing everything I can to reverse jinx it here.
Yeah, I think that a number of the players that we normally draft are certainly in the mix. I do think that week 12 bye players are no longer particularly viable, so that removes T. Higgins. But Kupp, Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf, even Tank Dell and Zay Flowers are all interesting selections. Colm, DK Metcalf is somebody I'm not targeting, and yet in situations where he does fall to a decent price and he's allowing you to set up some other potential elements. I mean, we know that we want JSN, but also JSN probably goes at a weird spot today compared to usual. How much are you thinking that this has to be a receiver pick? One of the elements that we're looking at here is that running backs are falling, and yet they're the names that are more or less not considered by my rankings at least, where we have Josh Jacobs, Isaiah Pacheco, Joe Mixon, Rashad White, and Alvin Kamara are the top 5 running back names. Certainly James Cook, Kenneth Walker, the guys after that, I think are more interesting. And in this format, I think you want to take advantage of the early prices at running back, but as soon as the elite guys are gone, you want to start playing it the same way that you always do, which is to really pick your spots and then load up on the contingent plays much later.
Yeah, so I think here with quarterback, we're happy to push it quite a bit. Josh Jacobs did go off the board, as well as Devontae Smith and Cooper Kupp, so that changed up the landscape. You mentioned DK Metcalf. Not against drafting Metcalf, and I 100% agree with you in this format that we are going to see JSN going a weird place, obviously well above ADP. The other names, Shawn, Tank Dell and Zay Flowers, they are both of a lot of interest. And the thing with it is I do not expect either of them to come back to us. So it's a case of which of those do we want? And I probably would rather Zay Flowers out of the 3. But if you want to go with Metcalf, that's also okay. Flowers would be my name. The suspense as Shawn makes the selection.
Okay, so I am going to click on Metcalf for us there.
We're getting the guys in the West.
One of the reasons for that is that, number one, we already have a lot of Dell and Flowers in our early teams. Number two, Flowers specifically is tricky in that I don't believe he sets us up as well for things that we might want to do later on in the draft. One of those elements is that, and you can debate how much difference this really makes, but we already have a lot of players with a week 12 bye. And I think that we want to try as much as we can now to balance some of the other buys. And Baltimore and Houston have the same buy, right? And so when you're trying to stack those two teams together or to create that correlation play, it's more difficult in this instance because you already have a buy that you're loaded up on. You look to where we are with the Seahawks, and I think that Green Bay, Minnesota, Chicago, opening up those teams on this particular roster is more the direction that we want to go. And again, I think that we kind of want to pick our spots and understand that JSN is not as realistic. And simply we have so much JSN that if we don't get in here, that's also fine. So those were some of the elements that I was looking at. I completely agree with you that in a vacuum, I would have preferred the player that you recommended.
Yeah, so Shawn doesn't like the player that I recommend. But who knows? I said he wouldn't get back. Maybe he does. I'm not overly confident. But so far, Shawn, we have selected our first wide receiver. And as we talked through it, Njoku went off the board, but that was also followed by Dell, Flowers, then James Cook. We're seeing some quick action with those last couple of picks. Usually I find when players are selected that quickly, it's that somebody is waiting for the specific name to make it through the pick, and it's quick then to make that selection. We are going to be obviously looking in 8 picks as to who we take next. You mentioned T. Higgins not being an option the week 12 by coming into effect there. And just for people listening in, we do have Kirk Cousins, Breece Hall, Dalton Kincaid, and Kyle Pitts all in week 12. So we are going to also have to fill out that tight end position a little bit later as well to allocate some of our resources to that. So through 6 rounds, week 12 heavily involved, but it'll be easy, Shawn, to balance that out as we go through the remainder of the draft. The player I was going to pitch as a potential running back option when it would come back to us was Kenneth Walker. He also went off the board. But some of the names, Shawn, exciting names, the likes of Xavier Worthy. We talked earlier about DJ Moore, but my preferred target in that wide receiver depth chart at the moment is Keenan Allen, who's significantly cheaper, obviously acquired this offseason. And then you have Jaden Reed as well as another wide receiver who I'm pretty excited about as we get ready for the season here. Are they your preferred options? I know there's quite a bit of time to go before our next pick, but picking up 2 wide receivers in these next 2 rounds, we talked about the options potentially being available for us as the draft went on, and the reason that we went with the quarterbacks, the tight ends, and the running back in those first 5 rounds being that there should be some of our kind of priority targets at the wide receiver position available in this range.
Yeah, so if we can get Keenan Allen here, that would be absolutely fantastic. He has the week 17 with Seattle, also has week 16 with Detroit, which makes Jameson Williams an interesting play later. He's obviously generated some good buzz. The player who probably doesn't fit as well is Jaden Reed for the same kind of reasons that I had mentioned with Houston and Baltimore, even though
that he's not in the NFC West. Is that it?
Well, it's not exactly apples in terms of that. Colm is not 100% on board with our NFC West draft plan here. But Jordan Addison, Rome Odunze, JSN could continue to fall through. I would love to be able to get Xavier Worthy onto this team. I think that his upside absolutely through the roof. This is again a case where his ADP is in round 9. Certainly to get him, we would need to take him at the 804. I think ideally for me, Keenan Allen would slide through one more pick here. We could grab him. And then, you're hoping that these teams in between, where Colm's Green Bay playoff beard in the 12th spot has 4 receivers. They might not be as wide receiver heavy. The other 2 teams, I would be worried that Worthy doesn't get through. The other way that you could play that would be to go with Worthy here and then take the Chicago player that makes it through.
Yeah, I'm good with both of those options. I think that the likelihood of Allen or Worthy getting back is very small, even based on ADP. I'm happy to go with Worthy here and see which bear makes it back if that's what you want to do. I basically what I'm saying is we have a list of wide receivers here: Keenan Allen, Worthy, Reed, Addison, Odunze, JSN. Get me 2 of those guys.
Okay, so we'll take Xavier Worthy. That's the most fun pick. Colm, our brand is drafting fun players. I do think that if we don't get Allen, that Jordan Addison is very, very fun. We would prefer to get the week 7 bye player here. And even though I've been skeptical about how Odunze scores to kind of meet his ADP as a rookie, I would be perfectly happy to grab him in this league as well. His ADP in round 10, perhaps he would come back to us in round 9.
And again, more so than normal, we are kind of playing some, mental gymnastics to try and figure out what the drafters are going to do, not just because they're drafting at the turn, for example, but because they kind of are preempting our every move and probably know what we're looking to do. So it makes it a little bit more intriguing. Keenan Allen does go off the board 2 picks after us, which, as we mentioned, it was to be expected. But when we're looking at, the ADP queue, that was one thing that made me think that maybe Allen would sneak through because he was a little bit down that list. And, it depends on if people are going by their rankings, the RotoViz rankings, or using a combination of both. But we have Alvin Kamara, Will Levis, Derek Carr, JJ McCarthy, George Pickens, DeAndre Swift, Bryce Young, David Montgomery, Daniel Jones, James Conner, Terry McLaurin. That would down at Terry McLaurin, that's where Keenan Allen is going. So there's quite a number of names in between. And, I mentioned the list of wide receivers we're interested in. None of those obviously coming up in that roll call that I did there. So we'll see how it plays out. But Addison or Odunze would be the priority option. And obviously we took DK Metcalf. Geno Smith is already off the board, which takes away the possibility of stacking the Seahawks, but I wouldn't be against having the 2 of them on the roster either in this particular scenario. So Dallas Goedert, JJ McCarthy go off the board. 2 picks away, Shawn. We're going to have our option here of wide receivers as we make it through here.
Yeah, and I think that our chances with pushing a Dunze might actually be pretty decent.
Yeah.
At least possible. The play here that I tend to not like in general, but do get some with Jaden Daniels. But the flip side of that is that once you have Kirk Cousins and Kyle Pitts, I mean, Terry McLaurin, again, opens us up a little bit on that buy side of things to have less, single digit round congestion. Is he somebody that you would consider here? We go back and forth a little bit in terms of Jaden Daniels. What is going to be the impact of him, not himself as a scorer, which obviously we're extremely high on, but what does he do for their receivers? His deep passing numbers last year were interesting because he wasn't a volume deep passer, but the results on those plays were fantastic. You have that same concern as you project him kind of across the board next season, where Washington may not be that aggressive in the passing game. You're going to lose passing attempts from him scrambling. And yet, if that offense is dynamic the way that we expect it to be, and if it's somewhat concentrated on Terry McLaurin, I really don't think that they have a lot of other directions they can go at receiver. I mean, this could be his breakout year. So I'm interested in him here and seeing where the rest of this kind of fun group at receiver falls, but I'm certainly not pushing that if you're out.
I'm not out at all, but we're looking through. In general, the pick here would be McLaurin and see, and then if Addison makes it, like Addison is a 2-round difference in ADP than McLaurin, so this is though right at his ADP, so you're not really gaining a huge advantage by taking him. But let's do it. We're going with more veteran players than normal, Shawn, here. Let's add another vet to the squad with McLaurin. I think every time I talk about him, I mention his rookie season being just so much fun as he came in and kicked things off. And he has been hampered quite considerably by the quarterbacks that he has played with. Still some concerns heading into the season, but the upside case that you can talk yourself into with the rookie quarterback and him hitting the ground instantly would be a spectacular season for McLaurin. JSN did go off the board one pick before that to the Geno Smith drafter. I was really, Shawn, there between him and Addison. And Addison, again, if we're seeing who might sneak back through, it feels like it's Addison over McLaurin. So, yeah, we're getting our veteran exposure here. You can tell that I'm completely sold on all these selections so far.
It's always fun to go back and listen to specifically the listener league drafts because they do have so many unique elements. Colm, if the team does do well, I know you will put this draft back out on the feed in early January there.
As we're chasing down the $100,000 top prize. So far, we have Breece Hall, Kyler Murray, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, Kirk Cousins, DK Metcalf, Xavier Worthy, and Terry McLaurin, and a slightly more veteran squad than we would normally have put together, but we're looking to put some nice pieces together in the mid-rounds. Shawn, as we continue on our quest, how are you feeling about the roster as it stands, and what are the challenges here in the next couple of rounds that we're looking to address?
Good. I mean, this one has been fun. We, made that second QB selection earlier than we wanted, and yet it was such a perfect fit. And we've been able to build some other things around that as well. We talked about how there are such great receiver values later in these drafts, in part because of all the QBs and tight ends going early. That has been the situation for us. In some ways, it would have been fun to get an additional star running back before this point, so you don't have really any pressure at that position. Kyren Williams went in the middle of 4. Travis Etienne went at the 504. He was somebody I was kind of looking at the potential for him to get back. Kenneth Walker went at 701. I thought that there was a potential for him to come all the way through there and did not. At the same time, we have lots of running backs in the queue whom we like. There's no real pressure to add to that position. We have a couple QBs. We have a couple of tight ends. We have the foundation running back. The nice thing here is that you don't have any positional pressure. You can take both this best player available and the players who best fit your build from a playoff perspective. And Colm, we are now 2 picks away from having Rome Odunze come back to us. He was one of the people that we considered in the last round and ultimately passed on, in part because we did think we would be able to get him here.
Yeah, so we were hoping that we might get him. We were also in the conversation with Jordan Addison. You'd mentioned some of the challenges around having Jaden Reed on the roster, but he also went, both of those names. Some other wide receivers that have gone in between: Chris Godwin, Christian Watson, Rashee Rice. We have had Jonathan Brooks, Jalen Warren go off the board at the running back position, along with Alvin Kamara. So Warren, again, somebody who we're very interested in, along with Jonathan Brooks as well this season. So all the teams starting to take shape as well. Levis goes off the board. So Shawn, 1 pick away from getting Odunze back to us, which I think would be a great outcome. You know, we would get Terry McLaurin, but we would also get one of those young players that we wanted to squeeze onto the roster. You know, we made the decision to pass up in Keenan Allen for Xavier Worthy. And at that point, we were having a conversation around taking Odunze with that Terry McLaurin pick. So if we could pick both of them up, I think that would be fantastic here. So we hold our breath as there's 32 seconds left on the clock. You mentioned some of the running back names that are in the list as well. So we have some of those potentially if we get our selection here for Odunze in that following round. Jameson Williams, also a player who's off interest, but again, I think we're looking to push him a little bit if we can. But for example, in Shawn's rankings, we have Odunze as wide receiver 37 in the 7th round, and Jameson Williams as wide receiver 44 in the 10th round. So Ramondre Stevenson, Shawn went off the board. I think Odunze here, with what we've already discussed, makes a whole lot of sense.
So we grab Odunze there, and as you mentioned, relative to the rankings, this is a multi-round value. It also allows us to build out this kind of secondary element where we're putting some NFC North pieces together. We have Seattle as the week 17 there. So Odunze, Metcalf, I really like that portion of it. The question that I have for you now is kind of getting back to the QB. And it's this element of Jameson Williams versus Bo Nix. If we look at ADP, Nix is the 909. Williams is the 1112. So we have questions about how this draft will play it. We have questions about the structural elements here. Also, you're getting some good buzz on Williams. So he's probably someone who would go ahead of ADP regardless. How much do you like Nix here? And what things are you considering from a structural perspective getting that third QB?
Well, Nix, again, by ADP, is usually going off the board at the 909. So that last pick that we made. So if he was to come back, he's, 6 picks after ADP at that point, or 7 total picks. So he is in play. The other thing I like with Nix, and we talked through this a little bit on the Friday edition last week, is it's a little bit easier to get some of the names slotted into the roster that are on the Denver Broncos. And, even somebody, Shawn, like a Greg Dulcich, who would then solve all our tight end buy problems, would fit in as well. So for the team, based on having those 4 wide receivers now at this particular point, that gives us the flexibility to go back. And that, for me, if we take Nix, that would be 3 quarterbacks and no more. And it would, give us that flexibility at the other positions then to fill out that roster. Are you thinking that that's the end of the quarterback pursuit?
Not necessarily. I think if you get a good price on one of your, I wouldn't say priority options, but an intriguing option late, you would definitely take that.
That
At
sounds
the
like Sam
same
Howell that you're talking about there.
right. If we can get Sam Howell in there to throw the ball to DK Metcalf, it's going to be hard to turn that down in the final round. One of the things you can do in these Superflex drafts is target a high upside backup. We've fallen into some good points that way. And Colm, one of the things we dealt with in last year's final is that quarterbacks were no longer starting for us at that point. I think we only had one QB who was going in the last round or the last week of the season. And so from that perspective, we were going to need to hit some very specific things in order to win. And we didn't hit those things and we didn't win, right? So you can create some more upside by using the low value rounds to take some shots there. But if you take Knicks here, one of the things that it does do is, again, give you flexibility. You don't have pressure to take a certain player because you're trying to get the upside that a third QB gives you. I think we go ahead and take Knicks, and then we're on Williams' watch for 17 selections.
Yeah, so I'm 100% on board with the Knicks pick. As I mentioned, there's lots of options that we can get, including Greg Dulcich. I like making these jokes, Shawn, on these podcasts, because then when people do listen back to them, 6 months later when this team's in the final, I can say that, I wasn't really joking. Like, I'm saying it as a joke, but I'm also going to have too much Greg Dulcich exposure this year. We have this every single season, that there's something like this, but the thing that got me there is Drake May got drafted one slot before Shawn, and on the draft board at the FFPC, it's red for quarterback, and I seen the red flash up, and I thought, oh no, Bo Nix is gone. But thankfully it wasn't Bo Nix. So we get Nix, and that gives us a third quarterback, and it opens up the door, as I mentioned, to more options as the draft progresses here for the likes of a Franklin if he was to come into the conversation to go with Bo Nix. So I think that decision there gives us a huge amount of flexibility. And with 4 wide receivers, Breece Hall is our only running back. We'll start to come into some of the 0 RB names in the next couple of rounds that we start to pick up on. So the way we are through 10 rounds, I think gives us just, we can go with the best player available as we move forward here, which is always a fantastic position to be in.
And the Knicks selection, definitely not easy. There are some other names we liked. We talked about Jameson Williams and wondering if he would come back. We only have one running back. Raheem Mostert at this price is an absolute slam dunk. Zach Moss, certainly an interesting play at this price. Javonte Williams, someone who, he could go anywhere from being a top 5 running back to the 3rd or 4th string guy on his own team. Trey Benson, a player who could really jump up and hit the home run this season. Running back is something we're going to have to consider in these coming rounds as well, Colm. Fortunately,
Shawn, we drafted a running back in round 1. We shouldn't have to consider it for at least another 8 rounds. Round 19, we'll think.
We can keep that player healthy and then select one more in round 20, and we have the roster set.
I guess the reason with the running backs is I do, as we see since our pick, it has been 4 wide receivers, 2 quarterbacks, and 1 tight end, Luke Musgrave. So I think that there's more of a chance as the drafters that we're drafting against may let those running backs pass through. We have the drafter, interestingly, in 2 only has the 1 running back, which is Jalen Warren, but everyone else at this point is multiple running backs, and quite a few teams with 3. And although that's not, some revelation that people have 3 running backs through 10 rounds, in this draft, I think people will be more willing to let some of those names fall through. So I could even see us potentially getting 2 of those names at our next 2 picks. But as I said, that Chase Young went off the board, and Jameson Williams. So I've really angered the fantasy gods with that. The other part, Shawn, I was going to mention earlier is when I said that the JSN pick went to the Geno Smith drafter, you were probably thinking at that point, why are we talking about Geno Smith? Because Sam Howell is the starting quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. Was that your instant thought?
I like Geno. I hope for his sake that he does bounce back in a big way with the new offensive coordinator there. I think the Seattle Seahawks are probably if you made a list of the 3 most interesting teams for the 2024 season. I think you have to have Bo Nix and the Denver Broncos on there, finding out what he is able to do with Sean Payton. I think you have to have the Seahawks, where you have both Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. You've got DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyler Lockett all together there with a couple of interesting QBs and a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator. Obviously, Ben has spoken glowingly about that element on Stealing Bananas. I'm excited to see what those two teams do. We have some exposure to both of them on this roster. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Sam Howell starts to generate some buzz once we're in training camp and those guys are competing out there throwing the ball side by side.
Yeah, well, that's what we're hoping. But I do think there will be a challenge at some point. And we have seen Gino in the last couple of years, since his kind of breakout season, struggle at certain points. And, now you have a younger player who's competing for that. Very disappointing, though, Shawn. Javonte Williams had gone off, but Raheem Mostert does go off 3 picks before us. That would have been absolutely fantastic if he had made it back. Player I'm interested, there's 2 names here. I don't know if you're just trying to see if we can hold off until one of them is off the board before we start to target them. But we do have both of the Cardinals running backs. Is that something that you don't want to pair with Kyler Murray in this situation? Or are they players that you're not as interested in? James Conner quite a bit beyond ADP at this particular point, coming off a career year for him.
Yeah, it's tricky there because, as you mentioned, he has an ADP in round 8. If we have a shot at him in round 11, I think that there's a great chance for Trey Benson to outperform him. And yet, the Connor price one, I think you would have to go ahead and take and see what happens there. I do think that Spears and Sutton are also pretty interesting at this juncture. Sutton, once you have Bo Nix. I like to wait for Troy Franklin. There's been a little bit of buzz about Marvin Mims. I don't think that you have to force that one. But you also don't want to avoid Cortland Sutton at a good price if you have Nix. So you don't want to be, overly constrained in your thinking. So we do get up here. Trey Benson actually goes 1 spot ahead of us. James Conner would be the guy by ADP. Colm, that's probably my lean. Are you seeing someone else that we should consider?
No, I think that based on the ADP, and I was going to say which one goes, first, and then we'd play the second one. But James Conner is now the second one, so I think at the ADP makes a lot of sense. And I'm believing that Sutton is going to make it back to us in 6 picks time, even though that is again right at his ADP.
So the other player that I love here, and especially when we consider some of the names that have already gone, like a Chase Brown, I would be pretty tempted to grab Spears and keep some of those late wide receivers available. How are you seeing that tension between Spears and Cortland Sutton at this juncture? Tony Pollard also available. That's one a little bit, different really than James Conner, where Conner's ADP in the middle of 8, Pollard's early in 10, Spears in 11. The gap in FFPC is less than the gap in Underdog, which is interesting. I think that Spears pretty clearly is the better of the 2 players. Now, there's some potential for the guy who got the contract to get the first chance. You do see even running backs bounce back at times. So I don't think that we can feel like that is locked into place. But Spears looks like a potential breakout star. His peripherals last season were excellent. He is a better receiving back than Tony Pollard. You get the full PPR in this format when those players get the receptions. I'm a little bit skeptical of both the quarterback and then how he's going to fit with the receivers here. I think that we could get a lot of Levis dump offs to Tyjae Spears.
Yeah, so we are, there's 4 more picks before our next selection. My feeling here is that Tyjae Spears doesn't get back to us. Tony Pollard did go off the board 1 pick after our selection. For me, Spears is clearly the player that I want to select out of those 2. I guess I'm very relaxed now with Hall and Connor through 11, but Spears would be a priority target in most drafts here for me. And as I say that, he did go off the board at that exact pick that I started talking about. So he goes at the 11, 12. And again, that opens up the door that hopefully now we get something back, because the discussion would have been between those 2 names in particular. But there is some other kind of semi-interesting names, the likes of Devin Singletary available, and somebody who we talked about last year during the season. The explosiveness and the burst seemed to be completely gone. That was Austin Eckler, but he is well past his ADP at this point. He would be available, but not somebody that I'm actively looking to draft. And then there's a lot of names that are just not off as much interest. Blake Corum is there, the running back up at the moment, coming in to be there with Kyron Williams, but it is Cortland Sutton, and then there's Jerome Ford, Kendry Miller, an interesting player still, Shawn, that we like, and then you're into Zach Charbonnet. So there is actually quite a number of running back options in this zone. But again, like most drafts, where we might be able to pick up 3 to 4 of those names through 3 to 4 rounds. In a draft like this, it may be a case that they all go off the board and the wraparound before it's our next pick. So a couple of those names are very intriguing for me, but probably leaning towards Cortland Sutton at this particular moment in time.
Yeah, if he goes, then it gets pretty tricky. I don't know.
Tricky or ugly? Which?
Yeah, I don't know. There's another name that I absolutely love here. It might be Charbonnet for me, even though you're jumping quite a bit further down the ADP list.
We got him.
So, Colm, Cortland Sutton, no problem here.
Yeah, I think it has to be.
So the picks that made that possible, we take James Conner at the 11:09. Then Pollard, whom we had discussed, immediately goes. Juwan Johnson goes. Tyjae Spears goes. So both of the Titans backs go within 3 total picks of each other. Keon Coleman, the other pick at the turn. And then we get a Kendre Miller selection. That one always disappointing, as Miller is one of my favorite targets, trying to keep expectations a little bit in check with him, especially if they're going to be using the tight end / quarterback / ultimate weapon down there by the goal line. You have to get through both Kamara and him in order to make that work. But I like Cortland Sutton. I mean, Cortland Sutton is not somebody I'm necessarily targeting, but I do think that once you're talking about him at the 12:04 with Bo Nix, he's going to outscore quite a few. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are scenarios where he outscores a number of the players ahead of him. And one of the things that is always nice for best ball is that Sutton, I think, has the potential to disappoint on some fronts and yet be a plus touchdown scorer.
The thing with him as well, if we look through this draft, and obviously he's a veteran player who has had his ups and downs throughout his career. He's had some injuries, but he is the wide receiver 1 on this roster as it currently stands, and there's not a huge amount of question around that. Obviously, we get Marvin Mims, we get Troy Franklin, so they may challenge him. But we look through this draft, and there's multiple other teams with 2 or 3 wide receivers already drafted before he is drafted. And I think to your point of maybe he doesn't outscore all the guys that go ahead of him, but the likelihood of him being a producer this season as the wide receiver 1 for the Broncos is very valuable when you're in the 12th round of this particular format. So he is intriguing, especially when you have a Bo Nix team as well to pair that with. So we will have 11 picks, Shawn, quite the wait now before it does come back to us. We still have, quite a few 0 RB kind of, or even rookie younger players that are going to be available. I added Greg Dulcich to the queue just so we don't forget about him, but that's
he moved in there.
That is he's currently at 3rd in the queue. I think we can slide him down, Shawn. That's going to be multiple rounds away, and eventually my heart will get absolutely broken when somebody does draft him ahead of us. But we'll keep that bit going for the rest of the podcast. But there is, we talked a little bit about Singletary. One of my things that I remember, we did a draft, Shawn, myself, you, and Zachary Kruger, that was at 2 a.m. my time. And I had to set an alarm, get out of bed to do the draft. And I believe it was Baker Mayfield that he was the player that, just doesn't excite you enough to draft at 2 a.m. So Devin Singletary has been kind of, I would say, one of my guys over the course of his career. Speaking of Zachary Kruger, myself and him have an ongoing joke about Devin Singletary. But Singletary got a lot of work towards the end of last season, stated to be the starting running back for the Giants. So he could be somebody that win this draft that continues to fall down, and that would make him intriguing at this next pick. But we have Charbonnet, who Shawn mentioned. I was about to say Jalen Wright, but he goes off the board. And then, at some point, maybe Eckler has to become a conversation. Vidal's there, Ray Davis, Bucky Irvine, maybe a little bit further down. But there's a lot of names here, Shawn, that I'm interested in at the running back position. Not as many wide receivers coming up here. The right. It could be a case that when we get to the selection, that somebody does stand out. But at the moment, not a huge amount of wide receiver names standing out for us.
No, but one that I do want us to keep an eye on would be Adonai Mitchell. I think that the FFPC format especially has folks sleeping on him a little bit. They have that week 15 matchup with the Denver Broncos and also week 17 with the Giants. Colm, there are Giants names that we often like to feather in there late. If you end up getting some Wan'Dale Robinson, getting some Jalen Hyatt in the final picks, then Mitchell, especially as someone that you like to have gotten onto that roster a little bit earlier to set that up. So he's someone that we can watch. His ADP is toward the end of 14. Dontavian Wicks, an interesting pick once we get pretty late. His ADP early in 15. Colm, where did Jerry Jeudy go in this draft? He goes at the 1301.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly at all, the drafter out of one with the fantastic Big Lebowski name, At Least It's an Ethos. That draft has been
on fire.
Absolutely perfect. So that's something we'll discuss a little bit when we get to the post-draft recap. But that team may be my favorite. Of course, when you have the first pick, it's incumbent upon you to not blow it because you've been giving that great opportunity right from the start. But man, I mean, if there's a team that looks straightforwardly like it could win the $100,000, that roster might be it. Colm, we're one pick away here.
You can't do that and not tell the people of the team. It's Josh Allen, Bryce Young, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs, Jameson Williams, Jerry Jeudy, James Cook, Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Brooks, Chase Brown, Marshawn Lloyd. So pretty loaded up so far. Romeo Dobbs does go off the board, so we are back up. I think, Shawn, the pick for me here would be Charbonnet and see if we can get Mitchell back in the wraparound. Is that something that you're comfortable trying?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get Charbonnet there. We have him.
Austin Eckler is going to go undrafted in this draft by the luck of it.
He's certainly not generating much enthusiasm. That's
for 30 picks past ADP. At which point does that become a consideration?
I don't know. It's so tough because anytime that you change teams as a veteran running back, everything about the prior thesis goes away. I think it's a horrible fit in an offense where you have a scrambling QB. I mean, he projects to be the receiving back. I'm not sure that there's a team in the entire NFL, maybe the Indianapolis Colts would be as bad or worse. Maybe the Baltimore Ravens would be. Austin Eckler is an absolute favorite. It's hard to see how he works in 2024. But again, if he bounces back, you're going to get a fantastic value on him here as he does go off the board.
But there is, again, when they're players that you're not targeting and they are on the board, it's always those. I mentioned this on some racing shows that you want those names to go off the board to push the guys that we want down to us. And we have been quite, I would say, fortunate, Shawn, in this draft so far, because we talked about the challenges of drafting against the listeners. But there's been quite a number of players. We have taken players that maybe we wouldn't normally take, the likes of a Metcalf or McLaurin, where the value became kind of too great at that point. But with others, we have, pushed Adunze through multiple or, a whole round to come back to us. And there has been other players as well that we've kind of discussed, like Charbonnet at that last Sutton pick, and he's come back. So we have been able to navigate and push for some ADP value as well. And those, so pretty smooth sailing. I mentioned at the start of the show that, after those first 5 or 6 picks, you can feel one way or another way about the draft. But I think the way that we've navigated those, rounds 6 through 13 have really set this team up to have a legitimate chance to win this league and then head on into the overall tournament. We do still have, 7 picks remaining, which that is a big chunk off the roster, almost a third off the team remaining to go. So we'll see what we do throughout the rest of it. But so far, 3 running backs, 3 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends, and then now up to 3 running backs. So very balanced. We do obviously have to look, and I don't even think it's that we have to think about the week 12 bye. We just have to try not to draft a tight end with another week 12 bye, but probably 2 more tight ends on this roster as well to fill things out. I'm pretty positive, Shawn, about where we're going with this team. 2 picks before selection.
Yeah, so the player who is probably least likely to come back and might be of interest is Kamani Vital. He would be a nice fit from a buy perspective. He's obviously a nice fit from a talent perspective. He's a nice fit from a potential volume perspective there with the Los Angeles Chargers, and he's a good fit in terms of what the team needs are. The fun pick here would be Mitchell, and yet if we're thinking about possibly adding a second Denver Broncos receiver, possibly adding a Wan'Dale Robinson, then we get to where receiver is maybe a little overrepresented on the roster. Just that we have to be thinking from the back to the front as well, something that you like to mention and really help the listeners with. When we think about some of the picks who are going to come in that 17 through 20 range, I guess things seems like it probably needs to be a running back.
Yeah, we also have to make sure that we draft Greg Dulcich as well, Shawn. So that's a spot already accounted for. So I think what you've talked through there is the way to play it, because Mitchell is the fun play. But when we look at, you mentioned Wicks earlier, there's a number of different wide receiver options. That's, not even taking into consideration the Denver pairing with Franklin, for example, or Marvin Mims. Then you're looking as well. Just there's a lot of other late wide receiver options with. When we talk about late wide receiver, Shawn, I think we're basically just talking about the Denver Broncos and the New York Giants. That tends to be our late wide receiver core. But there's, again, with the quarterback, the Superflex, and then the tight end premium, the names, if you're not familiar with this particular format, the wide receivers that are actually going in those later rounds will potentially surprise you, the names that will still be available. So, yeah, Vidal, the pick there. And this is the fun part of the draft as well, where we can load up that queue with lots and lots of options, because not that ADP goes out the window, but you want to keep track of the names that you want to add on to the roster as well, rather than, sometimes in these later rounds, names could potentially slip you by. And, if you're looking, as we mentioned earlier, looking at the ADP queue, for example, there's going to be a lot of names in there that maybe you're bypassing over. Shawn, a name in the queue that we're probably bypassing over would be Ezekiel Elliott. I don't see him being added to our actual queue, but he's there by ADP. But there's a lot of names in there that probably are not going to be names that we're looking to click on. And what that means, again, is we're looking at people to select those names to free some things up for us as we move through. Running back options that Shawn hasn't added to the queue that I am still intrigued by. Chuba Hubbard is somebody who may be there. But I'm intrigued, Shawn, to see how it plays out, but hoping that we continue to get our good fortune throughout the rest of this draft to fill it out here.
Yeah, Chuba is just now so squeezed that my concern would simply be that, I mean, it's a bad offense, right? And so Jonathan Brooks, you're betting on the talent to overcome. But with Chuba, you would need something to open up a spot for him, and then also the talent to overcome. Now, is he the most talented back remaining? I think that he probably is. And yet I think someone like a Bucky Irving is probably in better position to win the job outright when compared with what Chuba might bring to the table. So those are some of the things that I would be looking at there. When we're thinking about, again, these players who could be available later, we do have Mims and Franklin in the queue. We have Wandale. I moved DJ Chark in as an interesting play on the Chargers. I think that he's got a decent chance to lead that team in receiving, and obviously he has the Week 16 matchup with Denver with one of our quarterbacks. Quentin Johnston was a potentially compelling selection. He goes at the 14-11. We talked about the team in one, and both Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Legette go to him there at good prices. Colm, that's disappointing.
Sometimes, Shawn, there's no way around it when you're doing the show other than to admit our true feelings that's disappointing.
Well, you only get one pick every round, right? There's only so much you can do to grab the guys you want and block other drafters. Mitchell isn't going to come back to us here. Franklin's ADP, Mims ADP, those guys going at the 16-12 to 17-01. Probably you would need to take one of them at this next turn in order to get one. Do you have a preference there with the Broncos talking up Marvin Mims?
Not necessarily. Obviously, we know that what we've seen from Marvin Mims in the limited sample last year was electric. We've seen it in a limited sample that never got extended. There's a possibility now in year 2 that does get extended. What I'm going to try and do throughout drafts is have both of those guys, as kind of priority targets in this range. I think that it could go either way. You're looking at a second-year player who would be looking to take the jump forward, but you're also looking at a rookie who's coming in who has a rapport with his previous quarterback. So there's kind of a challenge there. Now, one part of that is Marvin Mims has gone off the board, so it likely leaves us to try Franklin. I've been drafting Franklin over Mims and trying to see then if Mims would potentially come back in those scenarios. So I would be prioritizing Franklin, but it's very close for me. Are you still on team Marvin Mims? Or and for me, it's very close. If we had a situation there where we took Franklin with our next pick, I would have been open to taking Mims, in the 16th, which is only 8 picks later.
Yeah, I have them pretty close. Have Troy Flankerin at the end of 12, Mims in the middle of 13 in terms of how my rankings fall out. They do actually both go. Franklin goes to the 15:05, 2 picks later. Marvin Mims goes at 15:07.
When I was talking, neither of them, Franklin one.
Yeah, neither of them come back, which again is one of the reasons why when a draft gives you Courtland Sutton, you don't simply pass on him and assume you're going to get one of those other 2 plays. Colin, for me, this is pretty clearly Bucky Irving now. I think continuing to add at running back makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we'll take Irving. What I think in these situations is when Shawn says it's pretty clearly Bucky Irving, knowing that Bucky Irving is kind of his guy, makes a lot of sense to add him at that point. The other player that, I was very confident when it got to the 14-12, that's where Mitchell went off the board. I was extremely confident that either Wicks, Franklin, or Mims would have made it back to us, and all 3 of them went off the board. We haven't talked a lot about Wicks on the show, Shawn, but did show some very nice highlights last season. But again, in an offense where there's a lot of ways that players could get squeezed, I did a draft with Blair recently where he and myself drafted Wicks in a Jordan Love team, and he was somebody that Blair liked. And we're looking at Christian Watson, Reed, the two tight ends, the running backs. There's just a lot of competition. Is he somebody you could see truly stepping forward and breaking out? Obviously, a couple of seasons ago we had Romeo Dobbs, and he kind of showed a lot of highlights, but it didn't really break out. And then towards the end of last season, he kind of stepped forward again. He's mainly been used as a red zone weapon though. But Wicks, what's your outlook on him?
Yeah, I think that one could end up being fantastic for both drafters and for the Green Bay Packers. He had a season in college, I believe the second to last, that was excellent, sort of foreshadowing what he did as a rookie. At the same time, I think we need to keep our expectations in check, understand how that offense will probably be more balanced than we would like. And if there's a breakout winner, it's almost certainly going to be Jaden Reed. And then when you have Christian Watson addressing his soft tissue injuries, and we say addressing, I mean, he's doing everything he can. And that's all you can ask of a player, is that they work that hard on it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be successful, but you have that additional threat that he ends up playing more, playing well. It does create a situation, especially when you have two quality tight ends, that the volume probably isn't there. And that's something that you have to be aware of as you're balancing some of these picks. By contrast, someone like a Wan'Dale Robinson, the New York Giants writers are suggesting that they certainly think that Malik Neighbors is going to be the guy who wins and leads the team as a rookie. And yet, I mean, Wan'Dale is good, and he's been floated as someone who could challenge that. I would expect him to be in a lot better volume situation than Wicks is. So then, you go back to efficiency and try to answer like how much better Jordan Love and the design for the Green Bay Packers is going to be than what Wan'Dale Robinson deals with. And yeah, it'll be better, but if things break in the right direction for the Giants, Wan'Dale, I think, ends up being an absolute smash. He's a good fit for this team. That's kind of where I would lean with this selection.
Okay, I'm going to let Shawn take Wan'Dale Robinson here on the allowance that if he gets back to us, that Greg Dulcich is the pick in the 17th round. Is that agreeable, Shawn?
Greg Dulcich. Yeah, I mean, we've got
third-year breakout. It's technically a second year because he spent last year on injured reserve for the whole season.
I don't think it can be technically that because, I mean...
I have an asterisk beside that season.
I mean, one of the things is that Greg Dulcich and Jatavian Sanders have a lot of athletic overlap, and yet people, for whatever reason, think that Sanders isn't athletic enough to play in the NFL, while Greg Dulcich, even after doing nothing for several seasons, is a guy who's still a little bit trendy. Now, having said that...
Well, Sanders did get drafted in this, and we're likely not going to see Dulcich go off the board to probably the 18th round if we waited, but...
You say that, but the team at number 2 only has one tight end. It'll be interesting, the different builds here, and we'll discuss this more in the recap, but team out of 8 goes with Okonkwo, Jonnu Smith, Jatavian Sanders as their 3 tight ends, at least so far, in rounds 14, 15, and 16. That is the opposite strategy from what so many of the drafters are attempting with the early tight end in this particular format. Colm, one of the names that I have in the queue here that you don't seem to be gravitating to nearly as much as Dulcich, Tucker Kraft, someone who I think is also a fit for what we are trying to do. And you could argue that it makes absolutely no sense to draft a tight end handcuff when there are other tight ends out there. But Tucker Kraft, very good down the stretch last season. I don't know if there's a big gap between him and Musgrave. He's playing in this offense. It's a similar type of element to, what you're looking at with Dontavian Wicks, where, Wicks brings that element at a position that at least in FFPC is less valuable. Tucker Kraft would be the way that I would play that.
Yeah, so Shawn, that seems to be the way that we may have to play it if it works out for us, because Greg Dulcich did go to the team in 4, who's also the Luke Musgrave drafter, which is interesting for that. Not that it feels like when we're having the conversation with Tucker Craft that I'm out on Tucker Craft. That's not the case. But I really do like Luke Musgrave, and I think he has the true star potential. But they're both very, very high upside guys. I think that the team is more invested in Musgrave, but I guess they're both rookie on their rookie contracts, and if it's a situation that Kraft takes that step forward, he could easily change the order off that depth chart. What are you feeling we need to do throughout these last 4 rounds, and who are some of the potential super late tight ends that you're interested in adding to this roster?
Yeah, one of the things that you do see when we get to this point is that tight end dries up, right? And if you wait too long, as we potentially have, you can get stuck with players that, basically burn a roster spot and don't do anything for you. I'm hoping that we can get Jelani Woods through these next several picks. We talked about the reasons why you might draft an Adonai Mitchell onto this roster. You have the week 17 with the New York Giants. You also have the week 15 with your Denver Broncos group. And, it's easy to think about week 17, but one of the reasons why week 17 has been fun for us the last 3 years, Colm, is because we were able to matriculate to that point. The first step in the playoffs is getting through week 15. Now, granted, these aren't going to be massive pods, and yet any little thing that helps you there or could potentially be interesting, I think, is something that you want to be always adding just at the edges, right? You wouldn't force it, but Woods is the guy that I like over the rest of the tight ends. I don't know that there's another tight end that I think is actually draftable. Oh, he does go 1 pick ahead of us right there. Colm, I think we pivot to a different position and come back. I think that Estime is an interesting pick at this juncture as a play off of the Javonte Williams exposure. Again, looking at this Denver Broncos team as one of the foundations of the roster.
Yeah, I think he would make sense. The other names, obviously, there's Will Shipley, who we drafted quite a bit. DJ Chark would be the other name, but I think we get the running back here and see what comes back to us. We did get nipped big time, though, Shawn, and I see you have added Theo Johnson and Darren Waller to the queue. I guess I'm still a little bit interested in Daniel Bellinger as the New York Giants tight end to draft, and I don't know if you've seen it, Shawn. I know you're not browsing on social media, but Darren Waller this week releasing a single, song, a rap of sorts. Not going to win any awards. Not going to recommend you go out and listen to it. Pretty bad, but it did pop up on the X platform over the last couple of days. But there's not, like, when you get into this situation and you do miss out, the names that are available are very, very tricky. Some of the tight ends that would potentially still be available: Zach Ertz, Waller, who we mentioned, Kobe Parkinson, Bellinger, Hayden Hurst, Tyler Higbee, Theo Johnson, Donald Parham, Jared Everett. It's just like there's not a huge amount to go around there. Is there any of them outside of the trio of, and you might just say it's 2 of the Giants? Any other tight ends that do anything for you there?
Well, I think Parkinson is interesting, and we have again, we talked early about doing the NFC West oriented squad. We didn't really end up being able to execute the Rams and 49ers portions of that. Wasn't a problem, right? We were able to pivot off of that and accomplish other objectives. And yet it might be interesting to come back with Parkinson there. They signed him to a decent contract. One of the things that you're always trying to figure with the Rams and teams like them, who's actually going to catch passes at the tight end position. If he ends up being mostly a blocker, I don't think that would surprise anyone, but also the likelihood of actually having a bit of a breakout, I think you would also have to at least keep that possibility open in your mind. With the Higbee injury,
any interest in Hayden Hurst? No.
Well,
I guess the play there is, who you mentioned DJ Chark earlier. The play is, who's going to catch balls in that offense. All we need to do, Shawn, is cover who's catching the balls in week 12. That's what we need. We need to cover this bye week.
And Hayden Hurst is someone who hasn't been relevant ever. And so
ever.
That makes him a little bit of a more challenging selection there for me. But he does address kind of what you had mentioned of getting a player from the Chargers and one who would help us positionally more than, say, a DJ Chark. Colm, we're balanced back out at running back versus wide receiver.
I was going to say, don't click the button because I wasn't necessarily wanting us to go ahead and draft Hayden Hurst just in case they were he was a name that was an option. I mentioned Bellinger. Then obviously there's Theo Johnson, and Parkinson is the other name that you'd probably be going for. Do you want to push tight end and see who comes back to us? Is there another, we did talk about Chark. Is there a different player you want to go for and see which tight end comes back to us?
Yeah, let's select Chark here, and
because like I said, there's
once you
the
get to this point, you can make your own tight end selection based on just overall attrition at the position.
Just whoever the third Giants tight end to be drafted is, we'll take him. But when, realistically, we're looking to cover 1 week with this team, and hopefully you would have enough upside that player then could be an impact on some weeks. But the names we're talking about here aren't going to be that. So I'm just willing to, at this point, see which options. And if it is a case that, you have to play week 12 with no tight end, you don't ever want to take a zero at a position. But the other part of that is, do you want to take the points over the whole course of the season or for that 1 week, with a DJ Chark pick versus the other tight end options that we're talking about here? So I think Chark made the most sense at that particular point anyway. Would there be a situation ever, Shawn, where you just roll and take the zero here at tight end, and depending on what players are available to us in these next 2 picks?
Yeah, I mean, in many cases,
it's probably not going to be the 15 points, and realistically, whoever we draft now in week 12 is probably 7 points might be a good return. You get 2 receptions. The balance of it is that's probably not going to be the difference of you making the playoffs or not, if your team's good enough to be in the top 2 to advance.
Right. And you wouldn't want to short circuit a potential, run to the whole thing simply by grabbing somebody here who doesn't do anything for you. So I think those are the things that you're trying to balance. But Colm, the flip side of that is that, when you're in round 18, round 19, round 20, you're probably not selecting that player anyway. Or if you are, it's because a very fortuitous situation that bails you out from, not even bails you out, but just it's going to be lucky, right? So we're going to take guys here that we think could potentially help us. We obviously don't have much clarity on the Giants tight end position. I guess I still think that Darren Waller will play. And if he does, then, that would be a situation that is a little bit game changing. Do you have a feeling on the direction?
I think he's going to be a musician. I said this, I don't know how long ago it was. It was a long time ago anyway, that my thought was that Darren Waller was going to retire. Now he may not retire, but the course of this offseason has not, and filled me with confidence that he's going to be an elite tight end. But when we are in this range, he does become interesting, because when he is the Darren Waller that had his breakout seasons, 8 to 10 catches in a game is not something that's out of the possibility, and in this format, that really is putting you into the high end of tight end scoring. And when you look at the names that go in between him and the guys that we can expect to have similar work, the only reason he's here is that he's going to retire, Shawn. But it might be worth the risk at this point.
So we need to kind of swing back around and at least consider the late quarterbacks. Sadly, and again, to our friend, at least it's an ethos, we lose Sam Howell, who was someone that we were also pretty seriously considering for a round 19 or 20 pick. There's been a lot of discussion about Jacoby Brissett with the Patriots, and that's one reason that Drake May's ADP has been more or less eviscerated across formats. He is still out there. Aiden O'Connell is someone who I think legitimately does have a shot to actually just straight up win the Raiders starting job. Colm, in our shows where we discussed who was going to be this year's Baker Mayfield or Geno Smith, that was a name that we bandied about a bit. Beyond that, I might be a little bit more skeptical. But even if Taysom Hill's overall scoring level is going to be down, when you're talking about a guy who gives you a shot at some different positions and might in a given week cover QB, if you had some sort of other cataclysmic scenario play out the way you didn't get points there, he's someone who is still available. Joe Flacco, obviously, in a Richardson injury situation, is interesting and is available. Unfortunately, Colby Parkinson does go at 1904 for a team that balanced out the tight end position pretty well. If you don't get the early tight ends, I think getting Njoku, Musgrave, Dulcich, and Parkinson together, that's a nice room. Jaheim Bell, someone we hadn't really discussed, but a player that I still have interest in, does go there. Colm, we're kind of being pushed back around here to your Hayden Hurst recommendation.
Yeah, that's not what we want to be pushed back around to, Shawn. Since we talked about him so much on the show, maybe Darren Waller is the pick that we should go for. So we have the quarterback option. We have 2 picks left to go. Blake Watson is the only we have Zay Jones as well, who would actually fit along with Kyler Murray. But at this particular point, we have set up with 7 wide receivers. So I don't really think we need the additional wide receiver outside of the correlation. I think we're pretty set outside if we're trying to pair it up with Arizona, and we don't want to take one of these or 2 positions. Are we? I think we go tight end and quarterback through these last 2 picks. And I think we take the quarterback first because we're not sold on the tight ends.
So,
and I think the quarterback is Aiden O'Connell.
Aiden O'Connell?
Yeah. Who's your pick?
I like it. Let's throw Aiden O'Connell in there.
That surprised you, Shawn. Who were you? Were you going the Taysom Hill route?
No.
Okay, I thought that
is an interesting name.
I thought that was what you were pitching for, was Taysom Hill down by the goal line. That was earlier in the show, I think.
I'm swinging back around in the direction of forfeiting those tight end points in week 12
and taking Zay Jones.
Well, we haven't talked about him a lot.
Hayden Hurst was off the board 1 pick after our selection. We have to announce that. A wasted pick.
The other potential play here would be to grab a different Indianapolis tight end. It's certainly not guaranteed in any way, shape, or form that Jelani Woods will be the guy. You know that Mo Alley-Cox always has his believers. Davis Allen still goes in some drafts. Gerald Everett is there hanging out with the Chicago Bears. Colm, we could take Jacoby Brissett on this roster as well.
We could. We have 5 picks to go. Is it? We ran out of tight end options. But the thing is, we have 2 elite tight ends through 4 rounds. So I'm not overly concerned about that. I am open to, moving on from the position. Jacoby Brissett did go off the board, so that leaves that. But Zay Jones are one of these tight ends. And as we talked it through, like Theo Johnson's a rookie coming in, could obviously step in immediately. But if somebody is going to, out of this group, is actually going to score points and doesn't retire, it's going to be Darren Waller.
True.
And if he retires, he doesn't score any points. Depends how much you buy into the retirement thesis that I've been selling all offseason.
Well, it's not just you. I mean, nobody else. I mean, these tight ends who have been drafted here have no value. I mean, and we're not criticizing their picks. We're considering these same guys. But, I mean, it is a bit odd. So
let's do it. We have spent far too much time, Shawn, talking about him.
Well, I wanted to pitch another player to you. What about in this Houston juggernaut? We have Dameon Pierce is still available. And when we think through someone who, again, might actually make a big difference to the roster, I could see Pierce being that guy. Any interest in that direction?
Not again.
You're like, no interest.
I have no interest in any of these players, Shawn, is what I'm trying to say. We do have Zay Jones, who would go in, but I don't think we need the wide receiver. I think the Pierce make more sense than Jones. The only thing pulling me towards Jones is the Arizona correlation, who we don't really have a lot to go along with Kyler Murray, which could provide a lot of upside in this particular pick. I think we should go with Darren Waller.
I thought we were back to Dameon Pierce versus Zay Jones. That's not the...
Well, I'll let you, with 36 seconds, I'll let you... If this team almost wins this contest, but it misses out because Darren Waller has like a top 15 tight end season and we didn't draft him, I don't know if we could live that down after all we've talked about on this show. But I'll leave the controller in your hands for this one.
All right, so we'll click on Darren Waller there.
Oh my goodness. I'm glad I didn't have to click the button.
Whew. Colm, is that the single ugliest pick we've made in our entire history together?
That may be it. I think that is it. But that was a hard click, Shawn. We passed on him for, I think, 4 rounds before we eventually missed. But we should have just drafted Greg Dulcich and we would have been fine. That's what we should have done. Yeah,
so Greg Dulcich did go in round 16, which was maybe likely here. We passed on him for Wan'Dale Robinson. I don't think Wan'Dale would have gotten back because Jalen Hyatt did not even get back in round 17. I still like that approach.
And I didn't take a little bit of
risk there. The mistake was not taking Colby Parkinson instead of DJ Chark. That was...
Yeah, I don't think that was a mistake. I have a feeling that the Rams just overpaid for a tight end, and there mightn't be much fantasy value there. But I could be completely wrong with that. What I thought when we took Robinson was I didn't think that Sanders, Mayer, Dulcich, and Kraft would all have went in the next 8 picks, which was what happened. And then Jelani Woods went 1 pick before us. So when we take that Wan'Dale Robinson pick, I'm pretty comfortable that there's like 5 options that we could take beyond that. So that was the part where it was a little tough that they all went. And that can happen in drafts. And like I talked about when we took Bo Nix at that point, to give us a lot of flexibility in the draft. But then sometimes when you are passing on a player with you're having flexibility, it can get caught sometimes. We did get a little bit caught there, but I think, again, if we were on the clock and those 5 tight ends are available and we have the option of Wan'Dale Robinson, I think we probably do that same pick every time, with the understanding that more than likely one of those tight ends makes it back to us in the 17th round.
So, Colm, this draft, so much fun. Again, we thank all of the listeners who participated, and we thank everybody who is listening to the show and will participate in one of our upcoming Listener League drafts. This is only the first of what will be several throughout the offseason. Our roster in this particular league is Kyler Murray, Kirk Cousins, Bo Nix, and Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, Breece Hall, James Conner, Zach Charbonnet, Kamani Vidal, Bucky Irving, and Aldrick Estime at running back, DK Metcalf, Xavier Worthy, Terry McLaurin, Roma Dunze, Cortland Sutton, Wan'Dale Robinson, and DJ Chark at receiver, along with the stars, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, and Darren Waller at tight end. A little bit more veteran-oriented draft today, but I really like the balance in terms of position to position and the way that we were able to navigate the draft and use draft capital in a way that allowed us to come out with the type of build that we wanted.
Yeah, we achieved a lot of the objectives that we set out. And even though, as you mentioned, more veteran players on the roster than normal, still fitting into what we were trying to build out here. And the thing I would say, we have the rookies and the running back room, and then we have Charbonnet, who's a young player. But the thing that I really like about this team is it will allow those rookies a little bit of time to come along. I think with Breece Hall and James Conner anchoring this team and getting Conner quite a bit past ADP, I think the running back room, although very young at this point in time, is set up pretty well there. Quarterback, we have a lot of options, and you mentioned it. I think there's a legitimate chance that O'Connell pushes to win that job, and I know Minshew's coming this year, but I think the team likes O'Connell, and I think they're going to give him an opportunity, whether he gets that to start the season or throughout the season. I think we'll see him play games. I just think we've covered a lot of ground to set up a team that what it really made me feel like is if we were doing this team and we weren't against the OT listeners, I think we could cruise through these drafts, because some of the players that we're trying to navigate, will we take here? Like we're talking about the Dulcich pick, he usually goes multiple rounds after he was selected here. So even when I was joking about taking him, he usually is beyond that. But there's a number of players in this draft that would have likely navigated back through to us if we were not drafting in a sharper room as we have here against the OT community. So looking forward to maybe doing a few of these with you as well. I'll be jumping in lots of these on solo drafts as well. You mentioned at the start, one of your favorite formats. I absolutely love jumping into these and playing through those lineups, having those drafts. So it's going to be fun to see how this plays out. Is there any, Shawn, of the teams that you want to highlight? We won't highlight all of them, but you mentioned during the draft, and I had not spotted it, and it was Colm's Green Bay playoff beard. That beard, Shawn, had almost disappeared from my memory completely. It's a couple of seasons back, but I enjoyed that comment. But we do have a couple of our regular drafters. Obviously, some people here have switched up the names. There's a lot of people we have drafted against previously, but Ryan and Daniel in there, John in there, Arn, as I mentioned earlier, Michael, Eric. And this is a very challenging crew to draft against. But the team in the one, Shawn, we had mentioned it a few times on the show, but they absolutely crushed this draft. And the Josh Allen, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride start is awesome. But then Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs, James Cook, Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Brooks, Bryce Young, Chase Brown, Jameson Williams, Marshawn Lloyd, Jerry Jeudy, Mitchell, Leggett, Tucker Kraft, Devontae Walker, Tank Bigsby, Sam Howell, Jacob Cowing as Mr. Irrelevant, that last pick off the draft, but could be very relevant in this season. That team just really stands out, both for uniqueness factor with the double elite tight end to kick things off with Josh Allen, really like a lot of the stuff that they've put together in that roster with the construction and with the players they've selected.
Yeah, that's Nick. And we've had Nick on the show before after his just sort of extraordinary best ball mania semifinals grouping last year. Not surprised that he would draft an amazing team. The question for that roster, I think, will probably come down to the quarterback position. He gets Bryce Young at the 901 as the QB2, and then Sam Howell in round 19 as the QB3. Looking through that team, is there a spot where you would swap out one of the picks for a different quarterback, or do you feel pretty comfortable with the guys that he's going into the season with?
I'm pretty comfortable. Like we talked about getting the elite quarterbacks. So you have Josh Allen at the 101, and then you're waiting on Young. Now, the one question is with the Howell pick, although we're extremely positive on him, it's like the other options that could have come in, but a bit like the picks that we were making and trying to do. You have the situations then when you're at the turn where you're waiting, obviously, that long stretch as to who might get back to you. So when he passes on a quarterback at the 2-3 turn, to take the two tight ends, that puts him in a little bit of a bind. And looking then at some of the other spots, he takes Stephon Diggs, could he take Justin Herbert, for example, but that might be one that comes into play, but I still would probably prefer Diggs at that point. I don't really see a definitive point. Jonathan Brooks, he took at the 8-12. Daniel Jones went off the board at the 8-10. We had talked about Bryce Young a little bit on our recent shows. Even Justin Fields goes at the 10-10. He took Chase Brown at the 10-12, and then Jameson Williams at the 11-1. So there's not really a standout one that I would be changing there.
And this draft was interesting from the perspective of the quarterbacks falling a little bit. We discussed in the preview show that ADP versus how we would play it was probably quite a bit different. Now, one of the things that we actually did in this draft was take a QB a little bit earlier than we normally would because Kirk Cousins was a fit for our roster. And that's something that you're going to have happen with other drafters throughout, all of these leagues. And so occasionally when you see QBs go in a situation where maybe it didn't make perfect sense from a structural perspective, it will be that type of correlation play that someone thinks, well, I mean, at Superflex, the quarterback can't hurt me that badly, and maybe the upside here is good. But you did see the QBs fall a little bit in that sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 round range, but then quickly come back to where Daniel Jones usually makes it to the 8-12, which would have been a possibility. He doesn't in this draft, so Nick didn't have a shot at him there. I agree with you that there probably isn't a good situation to add that QB. So I think that the team is really nicely put together the way that it is. It'll be interesting to kind of track Bryce Young versus Bo Nix and Drake May, who went early in 10, obviously contrasting that with Young at the 901. The only quarterback in between there was Will Levis. Will Levis went at a massive discount to ADP and yet might still not be a great value, but it does go to Ryan and Daniel picking out of the 7 spot. They approach this from the perspective of waiting at the QB position. I think the drafters who waited when they didn't have an option of the top 6 guys. So in this case, I should say the top 5 guys. Anthony Richardson, again, that kind of controversial player who does occasionally fall a little bit, including in my rankings. But you start out with CeeDee Lamb, you get Jahmyr Gibbs instead of pulling the trigger on Jordan Love or Jaden Daniels. That is an interesting decision right there. Saquon Barkley coming back in 3, Tua in 4. I think especially in Superflex, you have to love. Then Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is one of these backs that I think could be wildly undervalued this season. And then Deshaun Watson, Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, Will Levis. One of the things that Ryan and Daniel have done here is get good values on players who I'm selling. And so they're going to be, especially when you look round 3 through round 10, those are not guys that we have as targets. So one of the things you can do when you come into a draft like this is say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take some of those values, get a ton of ADP value in this draft, and that creates some cushion for maybe the other drafters being right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes that's like, for example, today we took, the Metcalf pick, the McLaurin pick. They weren't quite as much of values, but that was kind of some of the reason behind taking them. And you'll have drafts where you're able to get exposure to those different players. Shawn, something that we talked about on the preview show was the tight end position, and we have ended up with 3. Maybe we have 2.5, if we're being honest. But we have a situation where 3 to 4 quarterbacks usually is what we're looking to do in this. Most of the teams have drafted 3, some have drafted 4. Obviously, we mentioned the double elite tight end. Then we have Kincaid and Pitts with ours. But we have a Mark Andrews, Brock Bowers, Jaheim Bell pairing, which is also very interesting. We have the team in 8 who waited. They took Anthony Richardson, Dak Prescott in the first 2 rounds. But then they waited on Okonkwo, Jonnu Smith, Jatavion Sanders, and Jelani Woods in rounds 14 through 17 to get those 4 guys, which was probably one of the, we're looking at different ways to play tight end. We have a couple of different, very interesting ways in this particular draft. How do you feel about the tight end position this year? And really, that was something we did from time to time last year, was wait on those guys, the likes of a Hunter Henry. But last year as well, the absolute smash in those tight end rooms when you were doing that was Trey McBride. And it's very hard to see somebody being that kind of Trey McBride from this group here that is, going in the 3rd round next year out of the tight end group. How are you feeling about, waiting on tight end and then trying to pick up, 4 of those guys through those last kind of, from round 13 onwards?
Yeah, the volume approach in FFPC is definitely something that you need to be aware of, that you need to consider, that has been effective. I think that at the same time, 2024 for me sets up as more of an elite tight end type of season. And it's one of the reasons why we did get caught out, because we didn't really ever have any of these guys as good values. You mentioned a couple times that Dulcich went earlier than you were expecting. For me, Dulcich is really not much of a priority, and losing him, not necessarily a big deal. The one that, we lose here that is, I think, significantly more problematic is Ben Sinnott has that ADP of 13-12. He goes in our draft in the middle of round 12, right? So we selected Cortland Sutton. That was a good fit for us there. If Sinnott gets back to us at 1309, then we're set up nicely. He's a good fit with some of our other selections, and I think the draft works. Because he goes where he does, it makes it a lot more difficult. Then you're starting to look at players like a Noah Fant. I think that he would have been interesting. He goes at the 1403 in contrast to an ADP in the 15th round. That again, creates the pressure that you run into. Were we going to draft him ahead of Zach Charbonnet? Probably not. Would we have selected him even with Kamani Vital there in round 14? Probably not. And so one of the things that the drafts do right now that I really like is that the running back position is pretty interesting through these rounds. I think that might be the biggest surprise for me, is that we were able to get a lot of the running back targets. So our 0 RB guys were there. That was nice because we only selected 2 running backs through 12. And this is a format where that part is a little bit riskier. To be able to get those running backs in terms of Charbonnet in 13, Vital in 14, Irving in 15, and Estime in 17, it would have been difficult to, simply blow a spot on a tight end in order to create tight end depth. By contrast, I really like being able to have Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts up there at the beginning. And this is something I think that we expected in an RV league, but when Nick takes Laporta and McBride at the 2-3 turn, and then Kelsey and Mark Andrews very quickly go, you know you're going to be under some pressure. I was almost a little bit surprised that we didn't get Kittle and Bowers even earlier than they went, and they went early at 5:03 and 5:05. When you look at the players who went instead, you can certainly understand why they made it to this point. I mean, Nico Collins, Jaden Waddle, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs. You're getting star wide receivers at those picks. Colm, the Superflex drafts are so much fun because the addition of QB, it just injects so many more like legitimate, real decisions. I love that portion of it. When you look at how the running backs came off the board, does anything surprise you there? We did have a couple of teams that had 2 running backs through 5. The team out of 4, the Mingo 8-year baby, has a really contrarian build that I think is so much fun. I love when drafters go and do some things that are a little bit different here. The decision to take Christian McCaffrey, who is the ultimate tournament breaker in FFPC formats, he goes at the 104, but then you still get the 3 straight quarterbacks in Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, and Matthew Stafford. So now the quarterback position also a strength. Come back and get that great value on Travis Etienne at the 504, and then address tight end with Njoku in the 6th round. You go 6 rounds without getting wide receivers, but then you get Hollywood, Jordan Addison, Christian Watson, Tyler Lockett. Those next 4 names, I think, a lot of fun. It does demonstrate some of the difficulties, I think, once you get into the double-digit rounds there, where Shakir, Shaheed, Wicks, those players are probably almost pure best ball types of picks. And fortunately, this is a best ball league, so that makes sense. But I do think that it gets difficult at that point, and the other trade-offs that you're then dealing with are how are you building out the depth at tight end? We get Musgrave, Dulcich, and Parkinson. I do like that. But then at the running back position, you have the 2 early guys, but then you end up with Gus Edwards, Roshan Johnson, and Damian Pierce. One of the things I would have loved in this draft would be for someone else to have taken Pierce, for him to fall back through to this team that needed a 5th running back. That seems like a huge gift. So again, one of the reasons that you would play it that way and be ready is that you can then take advantage of the discounts. Gus Edwards, not necessarily someone we like, but a huge discount in this draft. When you need help at a position or you need to rebalance at a position, to get those massive ADP values is a great way to play it. And certainly you know that those possibilities exist in unique rooms.
They absolutely do. And this was unique. And the thing about what did I see with the running back position, I think it was just that it was, a little bit more unique that certain names fell. And as we talked about throughout the draft, we did pick a couple of names at the wide receiver position and that Bo Nix pick where we thought that we may see the running backs continue to kind of slide through a little bit. So that worked out for us. But that was a unique strategy with the 3 quarterbacks through 4 picks and then the 2 running backs along with them through 5. So the first wide receiver being taken in the 7th round. But the thing that they did do as well, Shawn, you mentioned like the Wicks pick, and then they have Christian Watson paired with Jordan Love. So there's some stacks in there as well. But it's quite an interesting team, but they did get quite a large portion of luck. Obviously, they take the 2 running backs and they're confident in Etienne and CMC. But if we, as we discussed, took that Damian Pierce pick, I think they're in a little bit of trouble then at the running back position potentially. So they did get away with it and get that additional running back on the roster. But I like, again, as you mentioned, trying to take different approaches and build out rosters in unique ways to try and gain an advantage in it. The last question, Shawn, I kind of have for you just is, we've kind of discussed this in the past, but the team in 12 did draft JJ McCarthy along with Jared Goff and Michael Penix, but they also drafted Sam Darnold. So they have both Minnesota Vikings quarterbacks on this roster, paired then with Justin Jefferson. They do have Amon-Ra St. Brown as well, paired obviously with Jared Goff. But how are you feeling, the Penix pick? I guess, the upside for that would be that, we drafted Kirk Cousins. Maybe Kirk Cousins isn't fully recovered from his, surgery, and that leads to him not being as good as he has been in the past, and opens the door for Penix. But outside of another Kirk Cousins injury, I don't really see a path to him playing this season. And then, but my question outside of that was the JJ McCarthy, Sam Darnold selection. We obviously like Aidan O'Connell. You're betting on him to win the job or to get playing time during the season over Gardner Minshew, similar with Sam Howell. But how do you feel about McCarthy? Obviously goes in the 8th round. I have no problem with that pick, but the Darnold pick then at 15-12, would that be something that you'd be looking to avoid, or how are you feeling about basically handcuffing a quarterback in this situation?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to some of the other values that you get and how confident you are in the Vikings just in general. When you have McCarthy there in round 7, that's where he also goes in this draft. I should say the 801, but that 7-8 turn. So you don't really get a big discount there, and you don't get a discount on Darnold. That part doesn't really matter at the 15-16 turn. What matters there is that the price to put that together is not prohibitive. So when you look at those two QBs and contrast that to what people are paying for maybe similar production in round 4 with Matthew Stafford, in round 5 with Justin Herbert, I think you can make the argument that Tua fits in that category. You can make the argument that the player we drafted, Kirk Cousins, fits in that category. Now, part of the reasons that we took Cousins is that we actually do like him as a huge breakout play there. The Cousins and Pitts together are going to be the league winning and the tournament winning outcome for you. I think that the Falcons will be very, very aggressive. I don't know that you're going to get that same effect from the Vikings, but certainly you compare the price of McCarthy and Darnold to the price for Geno Smith and maybe what he gives you. But one of the things that we're looking at here are what are the different incentives and how do you actually win the tournament? I think when you compare the price of McCarthy and Darnold to someone like a Geno Smith or someone like a Baker Mayfield and Aaron Rodgers, you probably feel pretty good about that. On the other hand, Geno Smith, even though his floor is well below what you are probably going to get from a JJ McCarthy, Sam Darnold sort of two-headed monster, there's also that scenario where he could absolutely blow up again. And I don't think that exists probably for McCarthy and Darnold together. If you do get it, you're going to get it from McCarthy and you're going to get it late in the season, in which case you probably like the Darnold pick back. It goes back to this question of where do you think you're going to get your Superflex points from? And on this particular team where you have Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Cooper Kupp, and Devontae Smith, maybe you get it from the receiver position, especially with Keon Coleman a little bit later. So I don't think there's a right or wrong on that. Those are just some of the trade-offs that you want to think through as you're building that roster. Colm, what do you think of this team that Eric has drafted, where you get Tyreek Hill and Bijan Robinson 1-2, you get Caleb Williams in round 3? One of the things that Matt Irby discussed this week was the value of grabbing these very top players. Tyreek Hill very easily could finish as the wide receiver 1. Bijan Robinson could very easily finish as the running back 1. In this draft, you get Williams coming back to you. I could see a situation where you pass on Trevor Lawrence there and
take 2,
add someone, like a Kyle Pitts or a George Kittle, a Brandon Ayuk, a Malik Neighbors. But certainly I think if you can get Tyreek Hill and Bijan Robinson and then still get Caleb Williams to come back to you, that's a very, very exciting start.
Yeah, if I was taking a quarterback there for the Trevor Lawrence pick, Tua went at the 406, Lawrence went at the 402. I would have paired him up with Tyreek Hill. I think would have made sense for the start of that draft overall. You mentioned some of the non-quarterbacks. That would obviously make sense as well. The other part is I'm a little bit conflicted this season, obviously, with TJ Hawkinson. He's coming back from his injury, but some reports are very positive, some reports are not as positive. So you go anywhere to missing a couple of games to missing, the first half of the season. He is the tight end 13 drafted in this as the tight end 1 on that roster, along with Colm, Juwan Johnson, and Dawson Knox. So tight end up until Hawkinson returns could be a little bit tricky on that particular roster. Then we have you have Bijan Robinson paired up then with Josh Jacobs, Zamir White, Kendra Miller, and Jaleel McLaughlin. So you've 5 running back build that I think could be a little bit short as well. But overall, I think the team is built out nicely with, they drafted Keenan Allen, who we talked about, but also DJ Moore to go along with Caleb Williams. So an interesting overall team, I think. So, obviously we take Kincaid, but Dawson Knox is somebody that I'm not really interested in at all. But in this roster, Shawn, when we were in the 17th round and we were looking about for tight ends, it wasn't going to fit with us because he's the same bye week anyway as Kincaid. But when you're at that point and you really need a tight end, I think it makes a little bit of sense. But overall, I think this is a very interesting roster. And you touched on Jacoby Brissett when we took Aidan O'Connell. And I think as a third tight end to fill out a tight end grouping after taking quarterback, after taking 2 quarterbacks through 4 rounds, waiting then to the 19th round and adding Brissett, I think it's an interesting move there as well. But I think I would call it an intriguing team that's interesting. I think the one thing that would have helped it a lot for me would be the Tua selection over Trevor Lawrence.
Another team that really stands out here as being interesting and being a potential tournament winner, I think, is Aaron's team out of the 3 spot. It gets Jalen Hurts, who is normally the second player drafted, and then A.J. Brown comes back through. Yeah, there are going to be plenty of teams that have that, even though both of those are early ADP values. Then you get Jonathan Taylor, you get Jalen Waddle. So we talk about how do you get that foundation QB and then how you dominate the other positions with your top guys. The A.J. Brown, Jalen Waddle is a lot of fun. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor is a guy who could make the leap back and finish as the RB1, maybe even the most valuable player in the entire tournament. You get George Kittle, who could be the most undervalued tight end. And then Tank Dell is someone we had been sort of discussing when we selected DK Metcalf earlier in that 6th round. On top of that, you get running backs throughout this draft who might see quite a bit of volume in Joe Mixon, Zach Moss, Rico Dowdle in round 14. Braylon Allen certainly would be that, nightmarish kind of handoff to Breece Hall. So that wouldn't be a good fit for our team there. But you look through, and I think in terms of executing this idea of select the QB early and then wait to get Daniel Jones and Justin Fields here. That's kind of my dream scenario where you have the 3 hybrid quarterbacks, the weekly upside there, absolutely through the roof. That team is fun. A couple other teams that manage this QB element as well. Out of the 5th slot, we get CJ Stroud in round 1, not another QB until Aaron Rodgers in round 6. That team has Garrett Wilson and Nico Collins. It also has the 2 foundation tight ends in Mark Andrews and Brock Bowers. I think you have to love that start. And then it's a question of what do you do at the running back position as you've gone 0 RB-ish. Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, easy to see how they would score. Javonte Williams, if he hits the upside there through the roof. Devin Singletary, probably a starter. Ray Davis, maybe the most valuable backup / committee back in drafts. And it's a little bit unusual, I think, to be able to get him at that price, certainly in this type of room. You could easily see him going ahead of players like Eckler, like Jaleel McLaughlin, Khalil Herbert late. So the balance there, I think, very well orchestrated. And then in the 6th selection, you get Lamar Jackson, and then not another quarterback until Baker Mayfield, who is put in with Mike Evans. This is a Puka Marvin Harrison team. And again, the running back firepower there with Kyron Williams, Alvin Kamara, and Raheem Mostert. And Kamara was a massive value in this draft. He goes in the middle of round 9. His ADP is in the middle of round 6. The execution on that part of it, absolutely fantastic. Some maybe slightly more controversial tight ends for us in Jake Ferguson and Dalton Schultz, but tight end was addressed. And so again, you have that nice balance all the way through. Colm, we see the drafters at basically every position here. Another one, Michael, out of 10, right, does a similar thing with the QB where Joe Burrow going in round 2, you could certainly argue is a stunning value, because if Jamar Chase hits, and that was his pick with the 110, if that hits, you're in fantastic position. This is a team that has a lot of receiving firepower. It's a team that has Evan Ingram, so they have an elite tight end. And then I like what they did late at the tight end position. Noah Fant, and then Mike Gesicki is another person I was going to mention to you as a possible late option. I mean, we've liked Gesicki before. Is it going to pan out? Probably not. It never seems to. And yet you have him on the Cincinnati Bengals with a Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow start. I mean, that's the perfect way to execute that. Getting Najee Harris there in round 9, that's another example of someone where you are getting basically just the normal value, but if it hits properly for you, that gives you the foundation RB. So I love these teams. The team out of 2 pick Patrick Mahomes to start. I think that is set up to be a league-winning selection now that you have the weapons for Mahomes. It's interesting because this team doesn't end up with the receivers. It does get Travis Kelce. That's the perfect complement, I think, for a lot of drafters. Even with Patrick Mahomes, they go back to the well with Jaden Daniels, who probably is our top priority pick at QB. The interesting selection, I think, is Justin Herbert in round 5. If you have a different position there, then maybe this team ends up being an unstoppable juggernaut. But even with making that pick, you have a lot of firepower at receiver, and then the running backs are put together very nicely. And we love Jaylen Warren, Brian Robinson, the starter there for what could be an underrated Commanders offense. And then Jerome Ford, maybe almost the full season Brown starter. And then Jaylen Warren with the massive individual week upside. Colm, love this league. Love what all of the drafters did. Appreciate everybody being involved in it. And it won't be our last one of the season.
Yeah, it won't be our last one. So if you are interested in drafting alongside us, let us know on Twitter at Overtime Ireland or email across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We will be setting up more in the coming weeks and months. That is a lot of fun, Shawn, to run through all those teams. So thanks again. You mentioned it already, but thanks to everyone who was involved. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.